Hi there, everyone. Good morning. My purpose is to talk about our collective role as reflexive advocates, and in the process to familiarize you with some of the latest relevant research specific to sexual assault and consent in gender-based violence education. To set the stage, my talking points are rooted in a critical feminist multicultural praxis, which draws on critical race theory, queer theory, and the latest feminist theories to promote theory-driven practices. One essential practice is reflexivity. Today, what we're doing here is potentially a reflexive practice. We're in community reflecting and holding ourselves accountable. One important question for reflexivity is about asking ourselves, who am I as a human being, as a sociocultural being with the different statuses and identities I hold, be that as an educator, for me personally, as a cisgender, white, able-bodied, heterosexual woman? And how does all of who I am bidirectionally influence my relationships interpersonally and my community? In the case of gender-based violence, we need community accountability to disrupt protective denial. We know in the scientific literature that protective denial is an important concept that impacts the well-being of survivors. Protective denial wards off threats to the self, core understandings of humanity, society, and institutions. Basically, we don't want to believe that the violence is true. It's threatening to us and to everything we know. Unfortunately, this denial results in negative social responses. The research here on social responses shows us that we render invisible the pain of the violence and of survivors who have been dealing with a sexual assault incident. These negative social responses and institutional denial hurt survivors. It perpetuates victimization through a process called secondary victimization. An important shift in the research on sexual assault was when we realized it's not so much the initial incident, but rather the social response to the incident that impacts the recovery process and worsens it for survivors. So basically, when there's victim blaming, denial, scapegoating, cover-ups, etc., what we see happening is that sexual assault survivors are likely to have more severe symptoms and a longer recovery process. Another piece out of this puzzle is institutional betrayal. This is a key term in the sexual assault literature that has done wonders for reframing how we think about sexual assault in higher education. It was coined by Jennifer Fried, and it conveys the negative impact that happens when our institutions fail to prevent or respond to wrongdoings. These wrongdoings may be perpetrated by any individual in an institution, and unfortunately, the individuals who are impacted, a sexual assault survivor, is dependent on that institution. So there's this implicit trust between the institution and the student or the staff person. And those wrongdoings might include a failure to either prevent the wrongdoing or to respond appropriately. It could be an act of omission or commission. Basically, it hurts especially bad when your college, the place you trust, the place you call home, doesn't keep you safe or provide an avenue for justice after some initial wrongdoing. And as people who are affiliated with these institutions, we have a role here. That's what reflexivity tells us. We are trusted representatives of educational institutions. So I suggest that we may be complicit bystanders, we may be perpetrators, or we can be advocates. A few avenues for advocacy, because I assume that's what we're all on board for. One is around the language we use. Advancing the language and messaging we use about gender-based violence provides an important tool to reflect to our students, to our colleagues, the underlying values and assumptions we make about sexual assault, consent, human rights, intersectionality. I want to give you some examples of the language and messaging we've seen across time in terms of sexual assault. One, quote unquote, he said, she said. In this message, sexual assault is equated as bad heterosexual sex, a miscommunication between presumably cisgender man and cisgender woman. It renders invisible the violence, it renders invisible LGBTQ identities, people. It's a message. A second message is I said no. And the definition of sexual assault relies on the victim to deny access to their body, as opposed to affirmative consent messaging of yes means yes. That's a different message. The last message before we go to the Me Too message, as an example that I'll share, is I was raped. In this message, defining sexual assault relies on the victim to call out the wrongdoing. Examples of messages. Now with the Me Too movement, this new message I'm excited about, it has this implicit we or us. So when I say Me Too, I'm joining a group, I'm being part of a greater we. I belong to something. Me Too represents a collective acknowledgement of gender-based violence as a collective problem. Unfortunately, we know this from the social science literature and from social movement research. Me Too messaging is vulnerable to some yucky assumptions. And I'm not the first person to say that. In fact, the founder, Tarana Burke, is doing a lot of work in this area. What we see happening sometimes is when we make an us, this idea of belonging, we also run the risk of making an other. And we know from the literature and we know from personal experience and expertise, who is vulnerable to being othered? Those who are already marginalized in society. Let's think of trans women of color who are at the heart of the gender-based violence epidemic. So Tarana Burke, the founder of the Me Too movement, calls out and calls in for recognition of privilege so that this movement can continue to put at the center the experiences of the most vulnerable and put an end to these crises. To tie up my suggestion here around messaging, it's that we use language where we've unpacked the underlying assumptions so that we can ensure safe access to education for all. The second focus I want to make around advocacy is to go beyond with what we're already doing and to make new opportunities. I offer as a suggestion for us to infiltrate our existing curriculum. We don't need to wait on institutional change. For example, for years teaching abnormal psychology, it's a widely popular class. People love armchair diagnoses, they love self-discovery. College is meant to be a time of professional development, human development. And in the curriculum, I go beyond the diagnostic manual and textbook by prioritizing sexual assault and gender-based violence curriculum. Students learn about betrayal trauma, institutional betrayal, what I've conveyed today, and its negative impact on survivors and campus communities. If you have another role, like I'm currently in a position at a research center with a revolving door of trainees, our how-to onboarding manual goes beyond what you would expect. It's not just IT and supplies. It includes language about trainees' rights to be free from harassment. So there's ways we can infiltrate existing opportunities and to build new opportunities. The term I'll use here for the new opportunities is something called institutional courage. This also comes from Jennifer Fried. She considers this the antidote to institutional betrayal. The latest data on gender-based violence shows that people who belong to marginalized groups are inequitably treated. And what we already know from what I've shared about secondary victimization, this is a problem. It's a substantial health problem for us. Lack of timely investigations, unequal treatment in institutions, all serve to exonerate gender-based violence in U.S. society. So if we believe it's a human right to have safe access to education, the violence that we see facing Indigenous women, trans women of color, groups that are particularly vulnerable and have higher rates of sexual assault, that becomes our problem too. By showing institutional courage, institutions can provide education to support supportive social responses. That's something people can learn, to not blame the victim. They can improve reporting procedures, provide prevention programs, support for victims, whistleblowers. We can lead or join these efforts depending on our affiliation with our institution. To close, I encourage you to be reflexive advocates to support violence-free education. Thank you.
Thank you, Ariana.